1957, when they walked out of that editing room, Kirk Douglas and Stanley Kubrick looked at each other for the last time. The last time. Because after that glance, years would pass, Hollywood would turn, the world would change, but these two men would never speak again. Hours remained until the delivery of Paths of Glory. Douglas watched the final cut. Kubrick watched him. A 10-minute argument unfolded. Voices never rose, but the words came out so sharp that the walls of that editing room seemed to carry the tension still. Douglas wanted something. Kubrick refused. Douglas insisted. Kubrick was stone. And then, silence. The kind of silence that offered no way back. Both were Hollywood's most stubborn men. Both believed they were right. Both saw backing down as personal defeat. And the decision they made that day in that room changed not just one film, but the rest of two lives. Douglas walked out the door. Kubrick didn't even look back. And for years, at Hollywood parties, ceremonies, galleries, even when they ended up side by side, it was as if the other wasn't there. Invisible. Gone. Nobody knows exactly what they said in those 10 minutes. But everyone knows the result. Two geniuses carried this grudge to their graves. The phone was never picked up. The letter was never written. The apology was never offered. There was only silence. So thick, so heavy that time itself couldn't dissolve it. But before we dive into what really happened in that room, if you want to hear more untold Hollywood stories like this, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for what comes next. To understand what exploded in that editing room, you need to understand who these men were before they ever met. Kirk Douglas wasn't born Kirk Douglas. He came into this world as Isser Danielovich, the son of Russian Jewish immigrants so poor that hunger was a daily companion. He clawed his way out of upstate New York with nothing but raw ambition and a jaw that looked like it had been chiseled from granite. By the time he hit Hollywood in the late 40s, he'd already learned the most important lesson. Never show weakness, never back down, never let anyone think they can control you. Stanley Kubrick was different, but not that different. Born in the Bronx, he grew up with a camera instead of a football, obsessed with chess and photography and the geometry of human behavior. While other kids played stickball, Kubrick studied angles. He taught himself filmmaking the way some people teach themselves to breathe, as if his life depended on it. And maybe it did. By his mid-20s, he'd already made a feature film on borrowed money and sheer nerve. He wasn't just talented. He was certain, dangerously certain. When producer James B. Harris brought them together for Paths of Glory in 1956, it seemed like destiny. Douglas had the star power. Kubrick had the vision. The project was perfect. A World War I story about French soldiers ordered to attack an impossible German position, then court-martialed for cowardice when the attack failed. It was anti-war, anti-authority, anti-everything Hollywood usually celebrated. Douglas loved that. Kubrick lived for it. The shoot in Bavaria went surprisingly well. Douglas respected Kubrick's meticulous preparation. Kubrick appreciated Douglas's intensity. They were both perfectionists, both demanded excellence, both refused to compromise on quality. The crew whispered that they'd never seen two alphas work together so smoothly. But that was on set, where the cameras were rolling and the work was clear. Nobody realized they were building towards something inevitable. Editing rooms are where films are truly made. You can shoot a masterpiece and cut it into garbage. You can shoot garbage and cut it into something watchable. Kubrick knew this. He'd taught himself editing on his early films, spending 18-hour days in tiny rooms, reshaping footage until it matched the movie in his head. For him, the edit wasn't just important. It was everything. Douglas knew this too, but from a different angle. He'd seen editors make him look weak, make him look old, make him look like a supporting player in his own star vehicle. He'd learned to watch the editing process carefully to make sure his performance stayed powerful, stayed heroic, stayed Kirk Douglas. As the rough cut of Paths of Glory came together, something started to bother Douglas. The ending. In Kubrick's version, after all the brutality and injustice, there was this quiet scene. French soldiers in a tavern, hardened by war, listening to a young German girl sing. And they start to cry. These tough, cynical men, broken by what they'd witnessed, suddenly remembering their own humanity. It was beautiful. It was devastating. And it made the protagonist, Douglas's character, Colonel Dax, look helpless. Not heroic. Not victorious. Just another witness to tragedy. Douglas sat through the rough cut 3 times. Each time, that ending bothered him more. This wasn't how stars ended movies. Stars won. Stars inspired. Stars gave audiences someone to believe in. This ending was too ambiguous, too quiet, too weak. He started mentioning it casually to Kubrick. The ending's interesting. Then less casually. I'm not sure about that last scene. Then directly. Stanley, we need to discuss the finale. Kubrick heard him. Kubrick understood exactly what Douglas wanted. And Kubrick's answer was always the same, delivered with that flat Bronx certainty that made you feel like you were arguing with a mathematician. It's perfect as it is. The final editing session was scheduled for a Tuesday. The film's delivery to United Artists was that Friday. This was it. Last chance for any changes. Douglas arrived at the editing facility early. He'd thought about what he was going to say, how he was going to frame it. He was going to be reasonable, professional, collaborative. He was going to explain why the ending didn't work from a commercial standpoint, from an audience standpoint, from a dramatic standpoint. Kubrick was already there, of course. He'd probably been there all night, making microscopic adjustments that no one but him would ever notice. The editors sat at his station, sensing the tension, suddenly very interested in his equipment. They watched the cut again. As that final scene played, the German girls singing, the hardened soldiers weeping, the camera holding on their broken faces, Douglas felt it again. That weakness, that defeat, that terrible human vulnerability that had no place in a Kirk Douglas picture. When the lights came up, Douglas turned to Kubrick. And that's when the 10 minutes started. What exactly was said? The editor who was there never spoke about it publicly. The assistant who brought coffee stayed outside the door. But people who knew both men could reconstruct it from sheer logic and personality. Douglas would have started diplomatic. Stanley, it's a remarkable film. You've done something special. But that ending, I think we can make it stronger. Kubrick would have listened without changing expression. Then he would have said something like, the ending is what makes the film work. Change it, and you destroy everything before it. Douglas would have pushed. I'm not asking you to destroy anything. I'm asking you to give audiences hope, something to hold on to. Kubrick would have gotten quieter, which anyone who knew him understood was more dangerous than yelling. The hope isn't humanity. In those tears, that's the point. And that's probably when Douglas played the card he'd been holding. Stanley, I'm a producer on this. I put up the money. And I'm telling you, as the producer and the star, that ending needs to change. The silence that followed that statement was probably 10 seconds long. 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours. Kubrick would have looked at Douglas, really looked at him, and then he would have said the thing that ended their relationship forever. Then you don't understand your own film. In Hollywood, you can recover from a lot of insults. You can recover from someone saying you're difficult, or overpaid, or past your prime. But telling a producer and star that he doesn't understand his own project, that he's too stupid or too vain to see what he's made, that's not an insult. That's a declaration of war. Douglas probably stood up. Kubrick probably stayed seated. Douglas probably said something about creative control and financial risk and commercial viability. Kubrick probably said something about artistic integrity and vision and not compromising. Their voices might have gotten louder. Or maybe they got quieter. Maybe they just stared at each other, two immovable objects, two unstoppable forces, meeting in a space too small for both of them. And then Douglas made his decision. He could fire Kubrick. He could recut the film himself. He could exercise every bit of power he had as the producer. But he was also an actor who respected the craft. And he knew, somewhere deep down, in a place he'd never admit, that Kubrick was right. The ending worked. It was brilliant. It was just. Not a Kirk Douglas ending. So Douglas stood up and walked out. He didn't say, you win, or we'll keep it your way. He just left. And Kubrick sat there, watching him go, knowing he'd won the battle, but wondering what he'd just lost. Paths of Glory was released in September 1957. Critics called it a masterpiece. Audiences were smaller than hoped. It was too dark, too honest for post-war America. But those who saw it never forgot it. The ending that Douglas had fought against became the most discussed scene in the film. Decades later, it would appear on every list of cinema's greatest moments. But Douglas and Kubrick? They never discussed it. They never celebrated the reviews together. They never even acknowledged each other's existence. At the 1958 Academy Awards, they were both in attendance. Different rows. When Kubrick walked past Douglas's seat, Douglas looked straight ahead. When Douglas gave a presenter's speech, Kubrick was in the bathroom. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe two proud men ensuring they'd never have to fake a smile for the cameras. In 1960, Douglas starred in Spartacus and needed a director. He hired Anthony Mann, then fired him, then brought on Stanley Kubrick. Wait, did they reconcile? Not even close. Douglas hired Kubrick through intermediaries. They communicated through assistant directors. When they absolutely had to be on set together, they spoke in the language of professional necessity. Move the camera here. We need another take. Nothing personal. Nothing real. Kubrick directed Spartacus, but he hated every minute. Douglas had final cut. Douglas controlled the production. It was everything Kubrick swore he'd never do again, be a hired gun for a star's ego. When Spartacus wrapped, Kubrick made himself a promise. Never again would he work on a film he didn't completely control. Every movie he made after that, Lolita, Dr. Strangelove, 2001, A Clockwork Orange, The Shining, he had absolute authority. Some say Douglas gave him that gift by taking away his power on Spartacus. Others say Douglas created the monster that would terrorize Hollywood for decades. Through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, Hollywood stayed small, and both men stayed huge. They'd be at the same benefits, the same premieres, the same industry events. Other feuds cooled. Other grudges faded. But not this one. Kirk Douglas would be telling a story to a group of friends, and Kubrick would walk by, and Douglas wouldn't pause, wouldn't look, wouldn't acknowledge. Just kept talking as if a ghost had passed. Stanley Kubrick would be holding court about cinema history, and someone would mention Kirk Douglas, and Kubrick would nod slightly and change the subject so smoothly you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. Michael Douglas tried once. This was in the early 80s when Michael was becoming a star himself. He mentioned to his father that he'd love to work with Kubrick. Kirk's response was immediate. Work with whoever you want. But understand, that man I don't speak. Michael was smart enough not to push. He'd grown up watching his father hold grudges. He knew this one was permanent. In 1999, Stanley Kubrick died of a heart attack in his sleep. He was 70 years old. He'd been editing Eyes Wide Shut, still obsessive, still perfecting every frame until his last day. The entertainment world mourned. Directors and actors gave statements about his genius. Kirk Douglas was asked for comment. His publicist released a statement. Mr. Douglas recognizes Mr. Kubrick's contributions to cinema. 17 words. Not a single one warm. People who knew them both said Douglas seemed relieved. Not happy. That would be too cruel, but relieved. Like he'd won by default. Like he'd outlived the argument. But others noticed something else. Kirk Douglas never watched a Kubrick film again after Paths of Glory. Not 2001. Not The Shining. None of them. Maybe it hurt too much. Maybe it reminded him of what they could have made together if pride hadn't gotten in the way. Kirk Douglas lived to 103. 103 years. He survived strokes, helicopter crashes, the death of one son, the changing of Hollywood from studio system to corporate machine. He wrote books, did charity work, tried to make peace with various parts of his past. But Kubrick? That silence never broke. In his 90s, Douglas did an interview where someone finally asked him directly, "Do you regret how things ended with Stanley Kubrick?" Douglas was old enough by then that he didn't have to protect his image anymore. He could have said yes. He could have said he wished they'd found a way to work together again. He could have admitted that maybe, just maybe, pride had cost them both something valuable. Instead, Douglas said, "Regret is for people who don't understand their choices. I made mine. He made his," which was really just another way of saying, I'm still right. Even now, even with him gone, even after all these years, I'm still right. But here's the thing about their 10-minute argument in that editing room. Both of them were right. Douglas was right that the ending made his character vulnerable in a way that could hurt the commercial appeal. Kubrick was right that the ending made the film timeless. Douglas was right to protect his image as a star. Kubrick was right to protect his vision as an artist. They just couldn't both be right in the same room. So they chose separate rooms, separate careers, separate legacies. They both became legends. They both changed cinema. They both influenced generations of actors and directors. They just did it alone, carrying the weight of that 10-minute argument for the rest of their lives. Paths of Glory remains a masterpiece. That ending still makes people cry. Kubrick's instinct was perfect, but came at a price neither man probably expected to pay. The friendship and creative partnership of two of the most talented people ever to work in Hollywood. Sometimes in life, you can win the argument and lose everything else. Douglas and Kubrick proved that. They stood their ground. They never apologized. They never reached out. They never admitted weakness. And they never spoke again. The last shot of Paths of Glory shows soldiers crying at beauty and remembering their humanity. It's about the cost of pride and the weight of command and the tragedy of men who can't bend. Neither Douglas nor Kubrick ever saw the irony. They made a film about the dangers of stubborn pride, then let stubborn pride destroy their relationship forever. Two geniuses, one editing room, 10 minutes, and 43 years of silence. That's not a tragedy. That's Hollywood.